afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the front lawns on the second day of JLF. We have an absolutely sterling cast of characters, travel writers, who we're going to spend the next hour with. But I think that this is one of the largest panels this year at JLF, and we have a lot to get through if we are to do justice to each of these wonderful writers. So the way that we're going to proceed is that we will do a round robin where each of them is going to introduce something of their work, and following that I will ask a few questions which some of them will answer, and hopefully we'll have about 5 minutes left at the end to take some audience questions as well. Now, the thing about travel is that it's never just about moving physically from one place to another. Travel is also a kind of feeling of capaciousness that transcends the boundaries of home, however we may define it. And when we travel, the categories that label us and divide us into separateness begin in some ways to soften. And this is something that I want to explore with our panelists. But what we'll do to begin with is have each of you perhaps introduce your work, your most recent work, tell us a little bit about it, and also tell us what was the most surprising thing that you found while doing the travel for the book. If we can start over there with Hugh.
Hello, well, it's wonderful to be back at Jaipur. And the last time I came, I was talking about one of my travel books, Nanda Devi, and an expedition there. And I used to do many rather more traditional style travel books like that, where you choose a place and you go there. And the interest is often in the difference between what you expect and what you actually get. And I've done that in South America. I've done that in several books, rather lazily, as my children say, just crossing England, near my own home. And most recently, I thought it'd be interesting to move away from non-fiction and do a travel book as a novel, so to speak. So my most recent book, which is called Viva Byron, is about the idea that Byron might not have died 200 years ago, as he did very sadly in Greece, the Romantic poet, but instead traveled, as he wanted to do and said so in his letters, to South America, and had lived on in South America and had adventures there with the great love of his life, this Italian countess who was inconveniently married to a count at the time, but who became his last attachment in real life, and in my book becomes his more permanent attachment when they travel over to the New World and try to discover that together. So it's really a variant on the travel theme. It's travel as fiction and exploring things that maybe I could no longer do in non-fiction.
Hello, I am Lamorna. It's so great to be here. I'll be talking today about my second book, which comes out in May. Don't forget we're here forever, which is a line from The Simpsons. Some of you may have got that, if there's any Simpsons fans. And it's about Christianity in Britain, and it's an exploration of young people, so anyone from the age of 18 to 35's relationship with this religion that has been in our country for 1,500, 600 years. And I was brought up in a completely secular background, but became interested in Christianity when a pair of my friends, who were a comedy double act, both converted to Christianity and both decided to become priests. And I interviewed them for about a year and a half, and everything about it was surprising. I was brought up in a completely secular family, and so each question I'd say, "Do you believe in the resurrection?" And they'd go, "Yeah." And I was like, oh gosh, how do I respond to any of this? So I set out on this journey all across Britain, and I interviewed 50, 60 young people who had converted to Christianity in their adolescence or in their 20s and 30s. One of the things that surprised me most was I spent a lot of time hanging out with nuns, and I had all these preconceptions about nuns. And I remember meeting this one nun, and I thought that to become a nun is choosing to miss out on so much, so many paths of life. And I said to her, why did you become a nun? And she said, because I do not wish to miss my life. And it was such a surprise to me. And I had this sense, which I hadn't thought about, that whatever path any of us choose to take, it is losing so many other options. It doesn't matter what you choose. You're constantly negating other options you could have chosen. And I think the whole thing was surprising. I knew nothing, and I'm now completely obsessed with every aspect of Christianity. It opens you up to this huge frame and lens of thinking about faith, of thinking of all faith. So whatever happens with the book, I'm so grateful that I got to write it, because it's changed me a lot, I think. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Bill Crozier. My book is Beyond the Snow Leopard, clearly an allusion to Matheson's book, but it's based on more than 20 years, that's better, more than 20 years of travels in the Himalayas. I started off with the traditional base camp trek, but then I did the Chadar, the trek on the river Zanskar in Ladakh, and did that about 13 years ago. It's absolutely fabulous. It's all changed these days because the road goes through there now. But we saw some snow leopard prints in the snow. And my friend who was guiding us said, oh, you want to see a snow leopard? You should come with me to Dolpo next year. And of course, Dolpo is the area that Peter Matheson visited and wrote his iconic book, The Snow Leopard. And it has to be stated right up front, he was only in Dolpo for 3 weeks, and he never saw a snow leopard. But he wrote the whole book, and it was very much his angst of leaving his family, traveling in the mountains, and learning his Zen Buddhism, comparing it with the Buddhism in the Himalaya. So I started putting together my journals, and I try and keep a journal because being a doctor, my handwriting is absolutely appalling. And I'd get home and couldn't even read it, so I thought, well, I better transcribe this as best I can. So all my journals went straight onto the computer, and then I realized there was a narrative building, and that the story I was seeing was not just the places I'd been, but their backstories, the history of those places, the previous people who've been there visiting, like Matheson, like a fellow called David Snellgrove, who was there in the 50s, a Japanese monk called Ikai Kawaguchi, who was there in 1900. And these were just great, great stories. And they were translating all the old monastic documents and telling stories way back to the 1500s. And so I got involved in the whole Buddhist side of things. I'm very much a secular Buddhist, but I just love the philosophy and iconography of it. And so my book was really spread over 20 years, and it's no secret, in the end, I did actually see a snow leopard. And I was just back in Ladakh last week where I broke my foot, but I did see a snow leopard feasting on its kill only 5 days ago. So that's the kind of stuff I write about.
Hello, I'm Charlotte, and I'm here to talk about my travel book, which was called Black Earth City. And it was the story of my year that I spent in Russia just as the Soviet Union collapsed. And it was, so it's a glance of Russia at a time of huge optimism and hope and idealism, a time when they welcomed Westerners. They were thrilled to meet and talk and hear about everything that had gone in those long years of the Cold War. And so I think it's a worthwhile book to look at again now, when we have such a different view of Russia, when we're so rightly very suspicious and full of hatred. Well, maybe hatred is too strong, but you know, what Russia is doing in Ukraine is, I think you could call it a genocide. So, you know, it's not, it's not a surprise that people are very suspicious of the Russians as a people now, and they associate them with their ruler, Putin. But I want to say that my experience of Russia, of the Russian people directly, was very different, very warm and open, and I believe that's still there. You know, so that's one thing that a travel book can do. It can remind you of all those sides to a people and a place that get lost in the politics of particular moments. Thank you.
I'm Philip Marsden. My most recent book is, which comes out actually in a week's time, but it's called Under a Metal Sky. And I suppose the biggest surprise of the book is that it became a travel book at all. I started off with an idea about minerals and metals and the way that they've changed us, changed our civilization, fired our imagination, enabled us to do extraordinary things, and also to spoil the landscape and to threaten us in all sorts of this ways. And it was an idea that I started off with, and it became a travel book. I sort of have a habit, I think, of writing travel, but it also reaffirmed the idea that actually the travel structure is just a great way to tell a story. And it's a series. It's really a series of stories associated with particular minerals, particular metals, progressing through the book. And right at the end, appropriately enough, is gold. And I found myself in the Caucasus, in the region of Svaneti, where anyone who knows the story of the Golden Fleece, Jason the Golden Fleece, will perhaps know or not that they used to pan for gold using ram's fleeces. So they put them in the river, and the alluvial gold would be washed down out of the mountains, and it would gather in the fleece, which they then hang out to dry, and it would glitter. And hence this myth of the Golden Fleece developed. Anyway, so this was Svaneti. So I went up into Svaneti thinking, well, how do I find some gold? And asked around and all sorts of people. And I came up with one name of a person who still panned for gold in a village. And I said, what's his name? And he said, people said, he's called McKenna. And I felt a little bit like William Dalrymple, who seems to, whatever research book he's researching, whatever he's doing, he seems to come up with a Scottish name, a Scottish person. But this man actually was a Svan, it was a local man, but he was named after a film called McKenna's Gold, which I remember as a child. It was a dismal flop in the United States. Gregory Peck, who starred in it, called the film a dismal Western, really a terrible film. But it was very popular in the Soviet Union, odd enough, and also, I'm told, very popular in India. Whether anyone knows it or not, I, as a child, loved this film and spent a couple of days with McKenna panning for gold, and came back with a tiny amount of gold, which I treasure. Thank you.
I had a career in finance, which was very over-programmed, and as I finished it, I thought I'd go and clear my head and went to Montenegro, among other places, where I started reading a book by a woman called Rebecca West, who many of you may know, who's one of the great travel writers of England through the middle of the 20th century, or one of the great writers. And she wrote a 1,200-page book about Yugoslavia, now 7 countries, of course, where she traveled through in the years leading up to the war. And it was very exciting to me. And she talked about the great Serbian Empire of the 14th century, and it was overrun by the Ottomans and disappeared and seemed to be reviving in the end of the 19th century. But this book finished on the brink of the Second World War, and I wanted to know what happened next. And obviously I knew the 90s had been a horror show, but I wanted to put it in a longer prospect. So I decided to retrace her footsteps and went to all the places she went in the book, and tried to tell the long story and talk about what she'd seen and how it had changed and what had happened in the interim. Maybe to give you just a clue of the sort of oddities one found, when I was in Montenegro, one of the great treasures in a town called Cetinje, the old capital, is the hand of John the Baptist, which is in a monastery. So I went to visit it, and there in a sarcophagus was the hand of John the Baptist, obviously claw-like, and a sliver of the true cross. And alongside it, a mummified body. And I afterwards asked, who is this? And I was told it's St. Peter of Montenegro. And inquiring further, it became clear that St. Peter was a Prince Bishop of Montenegro who had undoubtedly done some good things for his country, but had also been famous as a warrior and was described as falling on his enemies like wolves on a white flock. And I think, it just brought home to me the odd relationship between church and state and the people in much of the Slavic world.
Thank you for that, all of you. I think what that really brought home for me, this round of introductions, is that travel writing is such a broad church. And you know, we've been talking about books that are counterfactual novels about Lord Byron perhaps becoming the king of Peru, to talking about talking to young Christians in the UK and understanding them, snow leopards, you know, understanding Russia, a small Russian town at a particular time in its history, travels through geology and rocks and the former Yugoslavia. So there's so many different kinds of writings, and you know, it's at the intersection of history and reportage and anthropology often, and then there is the whole question of memoir. So I guess I'd like to ask how much of ourselves should we really bring to travel writing? How helpful or dangerous is it to sort of center the subjectivity, the I? Maybe Hugh could have a quick stab at that, followed by Lorna.
Sure. Well, this is always been a big question in travel writing, is how much the narratorial voice should intrude or be present. There used to be a tradition in British travel writing where the writer wasn't really supposed to be there, so that, you know, they'd arrive in somewhere like Syria and suddenly say, and at this point, my female companion left me. And you realize that they haven't mentioned their female companion once in the book up to now, and they're just dropping this in. And then we've moved right over to the other end of the scale, the pendulum, with some American confessional travel writing, where, let's face it, it's all about the author, and it's all about the pain they've been through and their journey, and there's very little about the place they're in. And I always feel you want a travel writer to be like your ideal companion. You want someone who will share something about themselves, but will also look out of the window with you and observe and try and interpret the world. So that's sort of a balance, perhaps.
And Lamorna?
I think for me, I always believe that stories demand certain ways or certain forms or certain perspectives, and that actually you don't know in advance of setting out on a project how much of the self you're going to need. So I think it really will vary from book to book. My background is in anthropology which was seen in the 20th century as a colonial handmaiden. There was this real dark patch with anthropology. And what it had was this subjective turn, where when I studied anthropology, you were constantly asked, why me? What am I doing in this space? So I think in that way, I've always felt for the kind of book I write, I need to be present as both the guide for the reader, but also so the reader knows that I am shifting whatever space I end up in. They are viewing it through my lens, which is only one lens out of many millions of lenses. For this book about Christianity, I always have like a sort of stupid joke version of what my proposal is. And my silly version of this book was, as a secondary thought, was, can I become a Christian in a year? Which sounds silly, but everywhere I went, I had this feeling that it was my introduction to this place, that this encounter with me and another Christian. And I had this feeling that I had to learn to believe in other people's belief, and to feel that change in me, to see as I go through. And as Philip said, that travel is often a really good structure for a narrative, that it was me changing with each person I met, understanding over the year more and more about Christianity, and hopefully taking the reader with me, so that the person at the end is very different from the start. And everyone I interviewed, they were so gracious and told me so much of their stories. So I had this feeling that there was this sort of equal debt between us, that I too wanted to share how I felt about it, how I felt about the idea of conversion, what I thought Christianity could do. So I don't think this book would have worked without there being quite a strong first person in it. Maybe I'm also a narcissist, it's hard to say, maybe it's a bit of both.
Actually, Lamorna, I fully agree with you. And I think that bringing your subjectivity and sort of making it obvious what your subjectivity is important, because otherwise it can be a bit disingenuous, and you kind of you disguise your subjectivity as a kind of universalist viewpoint, which can be quite dangerous. And as Hugh pointed out, a lot of British writing, in fact, did do that, particularly in the 19th century. I mean, the fact fact is that travel writing has really been a Western invention, or at least in modern times. I mean, you had the great travelers like Ibn Battuta and so on, but there has been a lot of travel writing in the 19th and 20th centuries that was dominated by, white men. And even everybody who's sitting on the panel today, comes from the global north, even though we are sitting in a country of the global south. And there are a lot of questions over here about who gets to say what about whom. And it's not that easy for Indians, for example, to swan around the world and talk about the rest of the world, because we're often told that we should be talking about India. That's our proper place. I'm somebody who's written about China, I'm somebody who's written about Japan, but that's very unusual. It's usually sort of people from the global north who seem to have this authority to be able to explain the world to itself. So I don't know if anybody has some comments that you might want to respond to this. I mean, do you think this matters, the fact that, Western travel writers have really discursively created the world for many people, and are you aware of this? And if so, how does that impact you?
I feel uncomfortable with the first person, which is strange because one uses the first person as the narrative thing. I think there are a couple of things that redeem it for me, and one is to remember that what one's doing is starting off in ignorance as an innocent, and you're simply providing the reader with that experience of building knowledge and understanding of a place or a people or whatever you are, whatever you're doing. And I think that enables one to bring the reader with you. I mean, there are different sort of authorial roles where you start off as an expert and you tell the reader what you know, which is fine. But I think that sense of being the reader's path to understanding is what redeems it. And there's something else as well, which I find constantly reminded of, which is the first person enables one to do, which is simply to be in the moment. Very often with travel, particularly recent travel, when one's exploring an idea, I feel, history or whatever it is, and the first person enables you to simply record the moment of being there, the satisfaction, the pleasure of research, of finding something out. And I think as long as one remembers those two things, of being an innocent and just being in the moment in order to be able to address more universal, more timeless themes, then, if you like, one can be forgiven for being a white male exploring the global south or wherever it is.
But have you ever struggled with the whole idea of orientalizing the people that you are writing about? How do you kind of not do that?
Of course. I mean, of course, one would be stupid not to understand that as a white Western male, you carry baggage. And I also studied anthropology like Lamorna, and the thing about ethnography is you're encouraged to disappear. And I think that is the point, is that one wants to tell the story, but as a personality, personally, I want to disappear. I just want to simply be the bridge, the vehicle through which the stories and the ideas are explored. But yeah, there's baggage.
Yeah. I think I came to travel writing from a slightly different point of view because Pallavi's right. Here we are, all white, sitting in India, talking to you. But I went to Russia really not to go to a foreign place, a strange place. I went because my mother was Russian, and my mother died, for me, unexpectedly, when I was 16. And when I arrived at university, I was meant to be studying Arabic, but it immediately became clear to me that what I needed to learn was Russian, and I needed to get back closer to my mother and to try and understand something of her by going to the country and seeing if I could see her there. And when I first arrived in Russia, I had this very strange experience that I would walk down the street and people would look familiar to me. People would have a bit of her look. So I had the sense, which was, of course, an artificial sense, but I had the sense that I was returning to somewhere familiar. And I wanted to find myself there. I wanted to lose myself in Russianness. Of course, what you discover is that you can't just become another nationality, however much you might long to. So that's really what I found out over the course of my time there. And I had I had to accept that. I had to accept I was never going to have their experience. And I was never going to lose my Western experience either. So, you know, we have to be aware of our standpoint, where we come from. That's our responsibility as travel writers. And it's one we should take very seriously. And we should also do everything we can to put forward other narratives and support other authors and other people from other places looking at the world, I feel.
So I've already told you that my work is based on my journals, and that was over a long period of time, just over 20 years. And I think there are two aspects of that. First of all, I was able to experience many parts of the Himalaya, so from the Karakoram in Pakistan, way across to Bhutan, and I've been to Tibet 4 times. To see the variety of culture was very important, and really one of the things I enjoyed most about travel and then travel writing is that I can sense the change in me. And I was learning about other cultures. As a doctor, I was appalled by the standard of care in some of the remote villages. And the thing I was able to do was to empathize. I never felt that by writing about locals, be they Indian or Bhutanese or Pakistani, I never felt that I was in any way exploiting them. I was in many ways trying to explain their predicament, their situation. I also felt terribly guilty because I'd go home and I could drink water straight out of the tap, and I could go to the supermarket and have a choice of 8 different types of apple. You know, I thought, well, you know, I'm very fortunate. But the second point I'd like to make is that I've been able to document a process of change, and especially in places like Nepal and Ladakh, the way the roads are being pushed through is both good and bad. It's allowing more tourists to get in there, so more income for the people, but it also allows the locals access to goods and good health care. So the change in 20 years has been dramatic right across the Himalaya. I've also seen the change in the glaciers. And this year in particular, like 2 years ago, the snowfall in Ladakh is trivial. And they're seriously concerned about the amount of water they will have in spring for their one and only crop. So to be able to document the change has been one of the kind of pleasant side effects from my point of view. And I think I'll continue doing it.
Thank you, all of you. You know, something that's interesting about travel is its dual nature. The fact that on the one hand, it's a very outward-oriented activity. You are looking out, you're observing things, you're writing about them. But simultaneously, it's also a kind of inward journey. Because when you travel, you don't only learn about other places, you often end up learning many things about yourself. So I'd love to know from a couple of people on this panel something that they discovered about themselves that they were not aware of had they not undertaken some of their travels. I think we already have people who've touched upon that a little bit, but anyone who hasn't yet spoken about that and might want to tell us a little bit about the sort of journey of self-discovery that is part of travel writing.
Yes, I think as I said in my introduction, when I felt my life before I started writing was programmed for months in advance, half hour by half hour. And as I traveled, I came to appreciate, I think, that time has 2 qualities. It can be your master and it can provide space. And that in travel, suddenly letting go of time and not worrying about when something should be, when the next appointment was or whatever, I could take time listening to music, enjoying the detail of art, thinking about religious systems or whatever. And you know, that has radically improved the quality of my life. Perhaps secondly, I mean, before the Second World War, when Rebecca West was traveling there were 4 communities in Yugoslavia: the Orthodox, the Catholic, the Muslims, and the Jews. And as you traveled around, and my family I am half Jewish. As I traveled round, you realized that now there were really only 3 communities, and in town after town where Rebecca West had spent time with Jewish people, they simply just weren't there anymore. And I guess first it was brought that to me, but also how lucky I was that my parents had moved, or my forebears, 200 years earlier, had moved to a country where there weren't invasions and people were allowed to live their own lives. And if they'd left later, I might not be here.
Hugh?
Yes, I think with travel and with travel writing, people quite often say, well, you know, what's the point? I mean, surely everyone's been everywhere. We know the world. You don't need to tell these stories again. And I always feel that we do. I mean, that there are still places, the places in between, as Rory Stewart put it, that we haven't necessarily visited and that we can discover for ourselves. And particularly, I find quite often people say, oh, don't go there. That's going to be really dangerous. And there's a suspicion about traveling to places. And almost always when I have been to those places, I've been greeted with warmth. I've been greeted with hospitality, both in India and all around the world, South America, mi casa es su casa. And it's always reminded me of the warmth of humanity and been a very positive experience in that sense, and reminded me of the strengths one can find even when one's warned against them.
Whilst I was writing, I had this quote from Iris Murdoch in my head, which is, she says, love is the extremely difficult realization that someone other than yourself is real. And I think it's beautiful. I think about it all the time. But I think the kind of travel writing I do is mostly interview-based. And in order to do that, I have to often speak with people with Christianity. You know, there's trying to run the whole gamut of Christianity. You can meet every single kind of person, as with any religion. But say, speaking with someone who has such different views than you, who maybe thinks that has completely different views on sexuality, and you have to both interview them and speak with them and be generous with them. And then you listen back to that interview 2, 3, 4 times in order to tell this story. You are inevitably changed by that. And what I think, I mean, yeah, as a travel writer or as an anthropological writer or as a journalist, if I didn't have this life, I would only be meeting, or be much more likely to meet people who are only similar to me. And instead, you're being confronted by the other, and it changes them, that encounter, and it changes you, and it's the best thing in the world. So I think every single interview I've done has had some kind of effect. And it's been confusing. I'd spend a week with nuns, and I'd get home, and I'd say to my friends, should I become a nun? Should I be celibate? And they'd be like, I don't think that's the answer. But then these little changes constantly shift the way that you are, and that's kind of awesome.
Brilliant, thank you. Charlotte, a quick reply?
My book is really told through stories of people as well. I mean, like Lamorna, it's really a series of short stories about the different people that I met and what they went through that year, because that was a year of chaos, hyperinflation, and the country that had been so rigid and structured for 70 years. For 70 years, all over the Soviet Union, you could buy a piece of bread for 1 kopeck and a cup of tea for 3 kopecks. And while I was there, hyperinflation destroyed the kopeck. There were no more kopecks. They didn't exist. And it went up to thousands of rubles to the dollar. So it was this experience of people's lives in chaos. And I think for us who live in a very stable society, to see how resilient people were and how they responded was incredibly impressive and wonderful. I felt full of admiration and awe, really, and I feel changed by that.
So, we've been talking a lot about sort of unpacking some of the broader issues around the genre of travel writing. But many people in our audience are actually aspiring writers. And I'm often asked the question that I will now pose to all or some of you, which is, what advice, if any, do you have for an aspiring travel writer? And the other tough question to answer is, where does the money for this come from, to be sort of swanning around the world, following in the snow leopard's footsteps, for example? How do you actually make a living out of it, or can you? Anyone wants to have a stab at that?
Yes, I'll perhaps I'll say something. Yeah, well, yes, I think the advice anyone who wants to write, I always say that. Well, it's not really a job, is it? But is to read. I think writing only comes from reading, and if you love reading, if you've had that experience of sensing what words can do and the way they can relay things, in this sense, other places, other peoples. If you've had that experience intensely enough to want to share it, that's where it comes from. So, to read in whatever genre it is, but to discover your genre, discover your real passions, is the root of all writing. And in terms of money, all the best material comes when you're not spending money. I mean, one can travel expensively and very pleasantly, but the best material, the best stories come when you're not spending money. So if one can get through that sort of barrier of international travel to where people live in a wonderfully diverse way, that's where it happens, and very often it's quite cheap.
I think it was Helen Keller, and I may be paraphrasing here, but she said it's only by going too far you can discover how far you can go. And I think in my experience, there have been some very adverse times, especially in the high mountains. Friends of mine have suffered, some have even expired. And that's a great learning experience. So you learn about resilience and coping with adversity. And then when it comes to writing it all down, you've got to have the passion. You've got to want to express yourself. I think the whole idea of perhaps thinking, oh, I'll write the story down and make some money out of it, doesn't hold true for me. I only wanted to write it down because I felt passionate, that I had some stories that I would like to share, some experiences that are valuable for maybe other people. So it's not a money-making effort for me, but it's certainly something which I feel very passionate about, and I think that's the root of it. If you make money out of it, that's possibly a good thing.
Yeah. I think also make that call. If there's someone that you think has an interesting life that you might want to write about, find their number, give them a ring. And often people just are so generous about it, letting you in. So my first book was about the Cornish fishing industry. And I called this couple up who I'd heard had a spare room in this small fishing town in Cornwall at the edge of the UK, and said, can I come and stay? I'm an anthropologist. And they said yes, and they thought that anthropologists were people who studied ants. So they were like, this scares me really weird. But I turned up there, and then I said, do you know anyone who is a skipper on a deep sea trawler? And they were like, do you really want to go on a deep sea trawler? And then you get to go on these things. And all it is asking those questions, and then they'll let you go. Luckily, you don't have to pay anything to go on a deep sea trawler. If anyone wants the experience, I can hook you up with some fishermen. But I think also, I think I have this sense of, even being here, all the interactions, the strangers that you're sitting next to, there are so many people with extraordinary stories. And if one of them piques your interest, follow it. Say, can I look up your writing? Can I follow you to this next place? We're all here, and I think everyone has an amazing story to share.
We have about 7 or 8 minutes left, and I do want to take a couple of questions from the audience. But before that, very quickly, if one or two of you could talk about one of your more notable travel experiences in India, I think that would be great. Anyone with interesting, fun story to share? Go ahead, Hugh.
Well, I certainly had some memorable experiences traveling in India. And I think taking some of the yatra routes up in the Himalaya, close to Badrinath, Kedarnath, seeing the devotees heading up into the hills on their pilgrimages, with a young presenter called William Dalrymple, who some of you may have come across, who was tremendous at introducing me to that area. And again, as I was saying earlier, it was the kindness of the people who greeted us. Pilgrims and devotees with very little themselves, and often wearing not very much to go up into the mountains, would always share what little they had with us, including particularly stories over campfires. And as Lamorna was saying, it's those stories you hear from the people you meet that make travel special.
Very quickly, Nick, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if this counts, but I mean, I found traveling in the northeast, both seeing the herds of rhinoceros by the Brahmaputra, where you feel you've gone back thousands of years in time, and then going up to Nagaland, where people seem to eat anything, and where there's sort of blue tattooed faces and people who clearly have done things that no one could do legally these days, was just a truly extraordinary experience.
Okay, so let's open it up to questions. Could you raise your hand? The gentleman in the green hat over there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, thank you.
Can you address your question to somebody in particular, if you'd like?
I don't know, maybe it's to all of you, but maybe I'll route it through you. So, I'm sitting here listening to all your stories, and I'm thinking that each of us have some stories, right? Maybe we haven't traveled X kilometers or miles, but there's always something to know from if you've been traveling with your partner, with a spouse, and very often, interchangeably, we've been asked traveling spouse, and something that we haven't liked very much, and I've had the good fortune of traveling to some places. So, do you have some stories of your traveling partners, and how different have they been?
We actually have a couple on stage with us who are uniquely suited to answering that question. So over to you, Philip.
We've travelled together, and we're still married. We're travelling now.
Only just.
We'll come back to that next week and see if it's still the case. But we've travelled with our children, actually, and all four of us, and it's actually, well, for me personally, it's been one of the great pleasures to be able to share that with our children. We both love travel. We've both been formed in many ways by travel, and to be able to sort of inflict it, if you like, on our children has at least given us satisfaction. I don't know whether they would share that.
Okay, I'm now going to be totally disloyal here to my beloved husband, who I love. But we've traveled a bit together, but he's impossible to travel with, because the minute he steps off the plane, he is totally focused on traveling. He pays no attention to anyone else who's with him at all. So after one long journey that we did together in Russia at the beginning of our relationship, I've stayed well away from him when he's working. Because he'll be much nicer to all of you than he would be to his spouse at that moment. But when he's not traveling, he's a lovely person.
I heard it here first.
So after that surprising turn to marital therapy, moving on, we have a question over here in the front.
Hands off to all the travel writers on the dais on behalf of the audience. I am Siddhagangaya Holathal from south part of India, vernacular language Kannada. I am like a bird around the nest. That is what we call Kutichaka, around the nest. I have traveled about 4 years on foot, 80 villages I attended and written.
Thank you, but can you ask a question? We have only 2 minutes.
Question is there. There is a tremendous response for this kind of travel. My question is, how is the scenario of global travel writing around the world? Because I am from the local scenario. That is the question.
How is the scenario for global travel? Because the gentleman is only aware of local travel, so it's a bit of a broad question. Maybe Hugh, yeah.
Well, I don't think a travel book has to be about global travel. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier, I did a travel book about walking out of my front door and walking across the bit of England near me. And in some ways, the best travel writing is the travel writing that isn't trying to be travel writing of achievement, where you go a long way, but it's concentrating on the writing, not the travel, and can be a very short journey out of your front door and in your locality. So I would suggest writing about often what is close to you as well as what is far away.
Any other questions? We have time for a final question. Raise your hand. Girl in the green t-shirt.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk today. It was really fun. I wanted to know about, I think, sir, on your right said about journaling, travel journaling, and I write a travel blog. So, is it better for me as a writer to write about my travel experiences on a blog and publish it, or should I keep a journal and then collect it together and think about publishing it or sending it to a publisher as a book?
Okay. The idea of doing a blog or a vlog and then publishing that is very modern to my ears. But I think the value of doing a journal is that, especially when I was transcribing things, I could then add more detail. I'd look at my photographs and I could say, well, the sky was very blue that day. I could also do some research and find out a little bit about the history of that particular place, that village, or that tribe. So it's got to be a long-term thing. I think just doing a vlog is too instantaneous. You've got to develop the narrative and develop the story. That's really about it.
Thank you. So with that, a big round of applause, please, for an absolutely fabulous and very well-traveled panel. We all had a great time being with you and hope you did too. Thank you.
Thank you.